Around April of each year, many of us are reminded of one particular time that has become part of aviation legend. The time when the skies fell silent. When more than 100,000 flights were cancelled and over 10 million passengers were stranded after an Icelandic volcano erupted. Within hours, European airspace began to shut down, and for nearly a week, aircraft sat idle on aprons as flight after flight was cancelled. And the crew? Well, we just kind of accepted that, apparently, that was what happened when a volcano exploded. You just didn't fly for a while. And if you were at home, you were staying there. And if you were away, well, you unpacked your suitcase in whichever city you happened to be in and you just made the best of it. We washed out our undies, rotated our 2 outfits and woke up each day to find out if anything had changed before making plans for another unexpected day down route. But how many of us knew the original story? The one that had needed to happen in order for those protocols to be put into place. Because the thing about aviation is that protocols and procedures are often written in hindsight, and lessons are, more often than not, learned the hard way. And so, this week, we've delved into the past to bring you the story of British Airways Flight 9, the service from London to Auckland. Its crew operating the leg from Kuala Lumpur to Perth, unaware that they were about to etch themselves into aviation history. The flight that taught the industry exactly what volcanic ash can do to a jet engine at 37,000 feet. Doors to armed and cross-check. Welcome aboard the Red Eye. 24th of June, 1982. Captain Eric Moody checked his weather radar. It was clear, completely clear, just the way he liked it. There was a smooth flight ahead of them for the next 500 kilometres. It was an easy leg. And while many of the passengers had been on board since London, for him and his crew, it was their first sector of the day. "I'm just nipping out to the loo," he said lightly, sliding his seat back and stepping out of the cockpit. "Keep an eye on things while I'm gone." The first officer and flight engineer murmured their acknowledgement. The cockpit door clicked shut behind him, and the aircraft continued its steady cruise through the darkness. Outside, there was nothing. The ocean below was so black it seemed to merge seamlessly with the night sky. No city lights, no horizon, just the faint reflection of cockpit instruments against the windscreen. And then, light. At first, just a flicker. Then another, and another. Within seconds, it looked as though a galaxy had come alive and was hurtling straight toward them. Small bursts of light flashed against the windscreen like sparks on metal. They flared and vanished, only to be replaced by dozens more. And then hundreds. The cockpit filled with a strange flickering glow as the lights danced along the edges of the windows and across the nose of the aircraft. The 2 pilots stared ahead. "St. Elmo's fire," the flight engineer suggested cautiously from his panel. 2 heads turned instinctively toward the weather radar. It was still clear. No towering cumulonimbus, no angry reds and yellows, nothing to suggest a storm cell anywhere near them or a cause of the static energy. And besides, St. Elmo's fire had a look to it. A ghostly blue glow, forked and fluid, clinging to metal edges. This felt different. Sharper, more violent somehow. The flashes intensified. "I don't like the look of this. Let's get a better look," said the first officer, switching on the landing lights. They both peered out of the side windows and behind them at the body of the aircraft. In the light, they could make out a thin layer of cloud, lit up on every side, enveloping the plane like a ghostly cloak. "I don't like the look of this," the flight engineer repeated. In the downstairs galley at the back of the aircraft, one of the cabin crew paused and looked up from her trolley. "The smoke seems thicker tonight, don't you think?" she said, glancing into the aisle. Another crew member stepped beside her and squinted down the dimly lit cabin. A faint haze hung in the air, visible in the artificial light. "I think you're right," she replied, shrugging lightly as she stacked the last of the service trays. "Probably the cigarettes from the Bombay leg." It was 1982. Smoking sections were still a thing, and long-haul flights often carried the lingering scent of 100 lit cigarettes. But this felt different. The first crew member stepped a little farther into the aisle. She was a non-smoker, painfully aware of stale smoke on most flights, and she'd never seen it quite like this. It was thicker, more metallic somehow. "Maybe we should check the toilets, though, just in case," she said, already moving toward the nearest lavatory. If there was even the smallest chance of an electrical fire, they needed to know immediately. At 37,000 feet, there was no such thing as overreacting to smoke. Further forward, a lady looked out of the window, noticing how the wings and mostly the engines seemed to be lit up. She'd only flown once before, and that time she hadn't been in a window seat. As such, she was no expert, but she couldn't be certain that it wasn't usual. But that smoke that had just started coming out of the air vents, surely that wasn't okay.
"The engine's on fire!"
Someone yelled from a few rows behind. Someone seated behind the engines who could see the orange flames bursting from the back of them, 20, maybe 40 feet long. "Daddy, look!" A small boy jumped up excitedly. "The engine's on fire!" His father tried to keep his face neutral, to keep his voice calm. "The pilots will sort it soon, son. Now, put your seatbelt on and close the window blind." "Good lad," he said, his voice catching as his son did what he said and looked at him as if to say, "What do we do now, Dad?" They were 3 hours from home. 3 hours away from the rest of their lives. And meanwhile, more smoke billowed into the cabin, and the light from the flames outside drenched everything with an eerie amber glow. Back in the cockpit, Captain Moody sat quickly back into his seat. Out of his left window, he could see Engine 4 glowing brightly, as if it were lit up on the inside. The flight engineer scanned his panel, fingers hovering over switches, eyes darting between gauges. Reports from the cabin spoke of smoke, yet nothing on his instruments pointed clearly to a fire source. And then a needle jumped, and he watched as engine number 4 surged and died. "Engine failure number 4, he said urgently. "Fire action number 4, Captain Moody responded immediately. They each fell seamlessly into their drills, shutting off the fuel and carrying out the procedures they knew by heart. Not that any of them had ever needed to use them outside of the simulator. And then, things took a turn for the worse. The flight engineer's voice sliced through the heavy air once again. "Number 2 engine's gone," he said, eyes locked on the dials. And then, almost simultaneously, engines 1 and 3 surged and flamed out right in front of him. Before either of the others had time to properly respond to the second failure, the unthinkable had happened. "They've all gone," he said, his voice grave now. "All 4 engines have failed." For a split second, no one spoke. Captain Moody took a moment to comprehend what was happening as the familiar roar of the engines wound down and dissolved into silence. To his right and just behind him, the first officer and flight engineer moved instinctively, slipping into the shutdown drills for the remaining engines, their hands working from memory while they waited for direction. And the aircraft began to descend. At first, it was subtle. A gentle easing forward, but he felt it in his body as it pressed against the shoulder straps. He tightened his harness, and in that instant, the reality settled in. A Boeing 747. Over 300 tons of aircraft. 263 souls on board. And no engines. At 37,000 feet, they had become a glider. "Declare an emergency," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Mayday, mayday, mayday, Speedbird 9. We've lost all 4 engines. Altitude 370. The first officer relayed, his voice controlled as the nose eased down and the altimeter began its relentless countdown. "Mayday, mayday, mayday, Speedbird 9. We've lost all 4 engines. Passing flight level 360. Each call was clearer than the last. But on the ground, Jakarta Air Traffic Control struggled to comprehend what they were hearing. The transmission was patchy, distorted as though something thick and unseen lay between them. "Speedbird 9, you've lost number 4 engine," came the reply. "Jakarta, Speedbird 9, we have lost all 4 engines, now descending through flight level 350. All 4. Captain Moody reached down and selected the emergency transponder code 7700, the universal signal for distress. If anyone could see them, they would know. But in the air traffic control tower, they had disappeared from the radar. It was as if, for a moment, they were in some other universe, and it wasn't one that any of them wanted to be in. Only when another aircraft nearby relayed the call on their behalf did the controllers understand the trouble they were having. But even then, while they were immediately cleared to land, the question was, would they make it? "I think we've cocked something up," Captain Moody muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the others. His mind raced, racking his brains for a moment before realizing there was no time to waste on the whys. In the simulator, he'd been here many times before. He'd lost the engines and landed safely, ditched even, but in the simulator, when they lost all 4 engines, they also lost the autopilot, but theirs was still inexplicably on, and so where was the drill for this? Well, there wasn't one. And by his quick mental maths, knowing they could travel 15 kilometers for every 100 meters they descended, he knew that they had less than half an hour to figure a new one out. In front of him, it seemed the windshield had been replaced by 2 bright white panels. They could see nothing ahead of them whatsoever. "We'll turn back to Jakarta," he said, adjusting their path. Behind that simple sentence lay another calculation he had just made. If they could glide far enough, if they could maintain altitude long enough, they just might clear the mountains along the south coast of Java. It was a long shot, and if they were too low, in the dark, they would not see the terrain coming before impact. Right then, it seemed to him that they had a possible 3 outcomes. The mountains, the sea, or restarting the engines and making it to solid ground. Only the last one was acceptable. Over and over, the crew cycled through the engine restart procedures. With each cycle taking 3 minutes to perform, they were all aware that they probably only had a maximum of 10 attempts. And to make matters worse, the airspeed indicators were not working, showing different speeds on either side at a time when they needed to be sure of it, that they had enough hope of restarting the engines. Captain Moody made another decision and disconnected the autopilot. He would fly it himself. He eased the nose up, then let it drop slightly, feeling for the aircraft's true speed through control pressures and instinct rather than numbers. searching for the optimum relight envelope, the precise airflow that might persuade the 4 silent engines to turn. In the cabin, a heavy silence hung amongst the smoke. An eerie quiet, interspersed with the occasional sob or gasp as the plane lurched up and down, bucking almost. And then, something else happened. With the engines not doing their job of pumping in air, and the pressure in the cabin thinning by the second, the masks dropped down from overhead, just to add to the horror. It was one thing after another. One situation after another that didn't happen in the simulator. Captain Moody looked on in despair as his first officer showed him his broken oxygen mask. The despair not even lifting when he quickly managed to fix it. Over and over, he could hear his crew trying to restart the engines. They had refined the drill now, trimming seconds wherever they could. Ignition, fuel, monitor, wait. But still nothing. The altitude continued to unwind. Ahead, invisible in the darkness, lay the mountains of Java. Beneath them, the Indian Ocean stretched out as a cold, black alternative. Neither option promised survival, but both loomed larger with every passing minute. Captain Moody knew the cabin needed to hear from him. He removed his oxygen mask, pressed the transit button, and delivered what would later become one of the most famous understatements in aviation history.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a small problem in that all 4 engines have stopped. We're doing our damnedest to get them going again. I trust you are not in too much distress.
A pause.
Will the CSD please come to the flight deck?
What else could he say? There was no script for this, no comforting fiction that would sound convincing in a powerless aircraft. In the cabin, many passengers had already reached their own conclusions. Some scribbled notes on sick bags and scraps of paper. Final words were spoken to loved ones, and parents held children a little tighter, trying to keep fear from showing on their faces. Others bowed their heads and prayed. And still, in the cockpit, the crew refused to surrender. Another restart cycle. Ignition, fuel, monitor. The aircraft descended closer to decision height. Soon they would have to choose. Aim for the sea and attempt a ditching in darkness, or press on toward rising terrain and hope they could clear it. And then, just as that final choice loomed, someone's prayer was answered. As suddenly as it had died, Engine 4 came back to life. There was a cough, a whine, and then the deep, unmistakable rumble of thrust returning. It rolled through the fuselage like a heartbeat restarting. For a split second, nobody spoke. Then every set of eyes in the cockpit locked onto the gauges. Engine 4 was running. Behind them, in the cabin, passengers who had been bracing for impact felt it too. It was without question the most beautiful noise any of them had ever heard. It wasn't enough to climb over the mountains yet, but with one single engine, they could fly around them if they needed to. And then Engine 2 coughed, and it too roared back into life. Moments later, Engines 1 and 3 followed, each relight sending another wave of relief through the cockpit. 4 silent fans had become 4 turning, burning, thrust-producing engines once more. Captain Moody reached for the PA again.
Ladies and gentlemen,
he began, his voice lighter, now almost buoyant.
We seem to have overcome that problem and have managed to start all 4 engines.
The applause that followed was spontaneous and thunderous. In the cabin, strangers grabbed hands. Some laughed, some even cried harder than before, but this time from relief instead of fear. They thought it was over. But it wasn't. Not yet. The aircraft began to climb, cautiously at first, buying precious distance from the dark outline of the mountains below. 15,000 feet, 16. And then the lights returned. The strange electrical flickering across the windscreen, the glowing particles streaming past. The euphoria drained from the cockpit in an instant. The aircraft shuddered, and Engine 2 surged violently. They all knew what that meant. "Fire action, number 2, came the call again, the words heavier this time. They had been here before, and they knew exactly how quickly 4 could become none. As the checklist was actioned, the first officer transmitted once again to Jakarta. "Jakarta, Speedbird 9, we are now on 3 engines." His eyes strained forward into the murk. The windscreen looked frosted, sandblasted, and as though it had been scoured opaque. "It's a bit misty out there," he muttered, leaning closer, switching on the blowers, the wipers scraping uselessly across the glass. Captain Moody looked to his left, noticing a small gap where he could see clearly, realizing that the windscreen had been damaged beyond anything they could do anything about. It was the only usable view he had. And then came another blow. The glide slope equipment on the ground, the very signal that would normally guide them down at the correct angle for landing, was inoperative. No electronic path to follow. No comforting needles centering on the instrument panel at a time when they practically had zero visibility. No, they would have to do this the old-fashioned way. Manually. On 3 engines, through a damaged windscreen, at night. The captain flew. The first officer became his eyes and his numbers, and through that tiny, clear section of glass, Moody searched for runway lights. At last, faintly, they appeared. A shimmer in the distance. Then 2 rows, stretching away into the night. "Runway in sight." Flight 9 kissed the earth at Jakarta Airport just after 9 p.m, without a single injury or loss of life. And yet, while the passengers celebrated, in the cockpit the pilots still worried they had missed something. What if it was their fault? Without knowing what had happened, there was a chance that they had done something wrong. But they would soon find out that they hadn't. On the night of June 24th, 1982, Mount Galunggung had erupted on the south of the island and spewed volcanic debris high into the atmosphere. With no warning system in place and a radar that only detected moisture, not fine ash, they'd had no way of knowing, and no warning to prevent them from flying through it. There was no prior history of this happening before, but when the aircraft engines were removed and forensically examined, they found exactly what had caused it. The ash and debris that had sandblasted the aircraft and caused the glow of St. Elmo's fire had not only fouled the communications and blown into the cabin as smoke, but inside the engines, the effect had been devastating. Volcanic ash is essentially pulverized rock and glass, and at cruise temperatures, it melts. The molten material had adhered to turbine blades as a sticky, glass-like coating, choking airflow and disrupting combustion. One by one, the engines had surged, backfired, and flamed out. Only when the aircraft had descended into denser, cooler air did the molten deposits solidify and begin to crack away. That allowed airflow to return and gave the engines a fighting chance of relight. What the crew had experienced as catastrophe was, in fact, physics. The men who had feared they might have made a fatal error were instead commended for extraordinary airmanship. Their calm decision-making, their refusal to give up on restart attempts, and their precise manual landing on 3 engines became textbook examples of professionalism under pressure. And the industry listened. After British Airways Flight 9, volcanic ash was no longer an abstract geological curiosity. It was a defined aviation hazard. Volcanic ash advisory centres were established around the world. Satellite monitoring improved. Pilot training incorporated ash encounter procedures. Engine manufacturers studied tolerance limits. It happened again in 1989 when a KLM 747 over Alaska lost all 4 engines after flying through ash from Mount Redoubt. They too managed to restart just in time, and the lesson was reinforced. So, when decades later, on the 14th of April 2010, Eyjafjallajökull erupted beneath its glacier, sending ash across European airspace, there was zero hesitation. Airspace closed. For nearly a week, the skies over Europe fell silent. More than 100,000 flights were cancelled, and around 10 million passengers were stranded. And now, you know why. Now, sadly, Captain Eric Moody passed away on the 18th of March 2024 at the grand old age of 82. But his calm presence and his professionalism has echoed through the aviation industry and will continue to do so. His famous calm announcement into the cabin was an understatement of the year, only superseded by his statement to a journalist when he had landed and asked what it was like to land the plane in darkness and with no engines. He was quoted saying, "It was a bit like negotiating one's way up a badger's arse." What a fantastic man, and the exact type of person for this job. Here's a small snippet of Captain Moody speaking on the show QI.
How did you stay so calm?
Well, what else could I do?
You're still so calm.
All I wanted to do was get my message to the cabin service director. Everything else was broken. The telephone system was broken. I tried the PA, and it only worked in certain areas of the aeroplane. And I had a little light come on to tell me that rubber jungle, you know, the oxygen mask had dropped. So it woke me up that I had...
It woke you up?
247 passengers sat behind me, and I wanted to get a message. I didn't know whether he knew what was happening. I needn't have worried because he was on the back of the flight deck when they all stopped, so he knew anyway. I was wasting my time. But I thought, well, what can I do? I can't get through, I can't shout. I'm flying the aeroplane because at this stage you couldn't get the autopilot to work. And I decided you have to sound quite laconic and laid back.
I love that. Wow. I think it's one of the best stories I have ever heard. And we are so privileged to have had you here in the studio.
Absolutely.
The Red Eye podcast is written by Kaylee Kay, narrated and produced by me, Ali Murphy. These stories are based on true events, but certain details, characters and timelines have been altered to protect the innocent. Visit our website, theredeyepod.com, to subscribe to our newsletter and to find out details on how you can contribute your story for us to turn into an episode. If you enjoyed listening to our stories, please like, subscribe and review. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Red Eye podcast. You guys are why we do this. We love the stories that you have, and we love telling you the stories that people share with us. To help us reach more people and get the podcast really out there, we would really appreciate it if you left a review. It just helps our podcast be a little bit more visible. Thank you.